Classical conditioning is how we learn to predict important events in our world. It's also known as Pavlovian conditioning, and to understand why, we're going to take a trip back in time to visit Professor Ivan Pavlov in his laboratory in Russia.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
To understand a bit more about the classical or Pavlovian conditioning, today we're going to talk about the behavioral processes as they're studied in psychologists of classical conditioning, then turn to looking at the brain substrates behind these processes, and finally discuss some clinical implications. To understand a little bit more about modern study of classical conditioning in a laboratory, we're going to bring in a colleague from Stanford, Phil Zimbardo, who's going to tell you a little bit about
behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic, unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
So that gives you a sort of in two different perspectives, from the recreation to some of the original filming of Ivan Pavlov, a broader sense of sort of what are the basic elements of classical conditioning. So let's talk now about those terms again, because keeping those terms in mind is important to understanding the rest of the story. So again, classical conditioning begins with an innate or unlearned reflex called the unconditioned stimulus, food, which unconditionally leads to a response. The unconditioned response, the naturally occurring response to food, is salivation. That's the UR. A neutral stimulus, called the conditioned stimulus, or CS, is then presented repeatedly before the reflex is triggered, producing a new reflex. This conditioned stimulus is the bell, and eventually it leads to a response, which in this case is the same. So the bell produces salivation. So just to sort of see it all schematically, there's an innate reflex, which is that food leads to salivation. That's the US-UR link. There's the training that occurs, where the dog is exposed to the CS, the tone or the bell, followed by the US, so that ultimately there is a relationship between that's conditioned or learned. Conditioning in this case means learning, so that the CS elicits the CR, the salivation. So it's important just to remember the key terms. There's the unconditioned stimulus, or unconditional stimulus in the original Russian. That's the stimulus that naturally evokes some response, which is the unconditioned response, the UR. There's a conditioned stimulus, the CS, a cue that is paired with the US and eventually elicits the anticipatory response, which is the conditioned response. You got that? This is perhaps the hardest part, is just getting all these terms in place. Let's see if you can apply your knowledge. Previously, you saw Pavlov's experiment from the perspective of the experimenter, Pavlov. But if you see this cartoon here, it says, one dog says to the other, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." So from the dog's perspective, let's flip the scenery now. From the dog's perspective, as illustrated in this cartoon, the scenario seems quite different. So using the cartoon here, identify Pavlov's CS and CR as viewed by the dog. So remember, this is applying your knowledge to the dog training Pavlov, not Pavlov training the dog. And the answer is, the CS in this case is the dog drooling. The response that Pavlov has learned is the book. So the idea is that we can look at learning situations in many different perspectives and see both that the dog is being classically conditioned, but in some way so is Pavlov being conditioned to write in his book the little bit of data whenever the dog drools. So the video mentioned that we can both acquire an association, but also extinguish an association, and that's what's schematized here. So acquisition, this shows, each column shows a sort of a point in time or a trial, and initially only the meat leads to the salivation response. When they're paired during acquisition, so that when you present you get the conditioned stimulus, the meat, and you get the response. That's what creates the learning, so that at the beginning of the extinction trial, presenting the conditioned stimulus, the tone, leads to the salivary response. But what if the meat never shows up again? What if you keep presenting the tone over and over again and there's no meat? Well, initially the animal will still be expecting the meat, but eventually this response will extinguish. Okay, and so extinction is the decrease of the conditioned response when the cue is no longer paired or is repeatedly unpaired with the unconditioned stimulus. Now, one of the interesting things that happens is that if you have a pause for a while and you go away and you come back, and even though the animal previously had extinguished the response, you often see a temporary return of an extinguished response after a delay. It's called spontaneous recovery. And one of the things we'll look at later in this talk is what are the underlying mechanisms that would lead this spontaneous recovery to happen. So that's the basic sort of structure of a conditioning study, but there are varieties of types of conditioning, and they're generally organized into two different types. There's aversive conditioning. That's when the US is unpleasant. So an electric shock would certainly one unpleasant outcome to predict, and I'll describe that in a second. Another is air puff to the eye, which is sort of annoying, and that's a form of conditioning called eye blink conditioning. So let's look at these examples here of aversive conditioning, where the thing you're predicting is aversive. So in odor conditioning, what happens is that there are two parts to a tube, and there are flies, and when a fly is exposed to a shock, it tries to escape. And in this case, what they do is they paired one odor with the flies being shocked and another odor with the flies not being shocked. And then later on, after this pairing had taken place, so the CS initially is an odor, it's neutral, the flies are happy with odor 1 or odor 2, but if they're constantly shocked when they're in the presence of odor 2, what happens if you put them in the middle, they will move to avoid the shock. So this is an avoidance response. And because this kind of avoidance learning is so critical to survival, it's often very rapid. In fact, you often see aversive conditioning happening in just one trial like this. So aversive conditioning, the new CSCR reflex helps avoid the noxious US. Eye blink conditioning is another form of aversive conditioning. It involves, and one of the things that's appealing about it is that you can do it just about identically in both animals, particularly rabbits, shown here on the left, or in humans, shown on the right. And what happens in eye blink conditioning is a puff of air to the eye naturally produces an eye blink. If you don't trust me, if you don't believe that, just try blowing in someone's eye and you'll see that they blink. The CS can be like in the Pavlov experiments, a tone or a light, something that's neutral. But when that tone or light is paired with the air puff, eventually the tone alone, the CS alone, will come to produce a eye closure. This form of aversive conditioning prepares the eye to avoid the US. And we'll come back to this. We'll describe this in somewhat detail here now, because later we're going to talk about the neural substrates of this form of conditioning. So in eye blink conditioning, initially the tone does not produce any response in the rabbit. The tone, when it's paired with an air puff, which causes an eye blink, and ultimately the tone alone will cause the air puff to blink. And the effectiveness, unlike the odor, the shock reflex, the effectiveness of the CS builds gradually over many pairings with the US. And in fact, this gradual building up of responding, measured here by the percent of times that the rabbit or the human blinks, is a learning curve that's used to describe the data from these experiments. And you can see in both rabbit eye blink conditioning and human eye blink conditioning, there's the same gradual learning, although it takes far more trials in a rabbit than it does in a human to get the same level of responding. So note how the initial CS tone causes no response. Then the CR early eye blink helps to prepare the animal for the coming air puff. So it's important to note that in this case, the CR is not exactly the same as the CS. It takes place before the US and can even be different in speed and form. So let's look at the timing of this response. And of course, this reminds us back of Pavlov. The point of the salivation that the dogs were doing is that it took place before the food arrived, and it helped the animal, and its sort of motivation is that it helped the animal prepare to eat food. In this case, it helps the rabbit prepare to protect itself from the eye puff. So let's look at the timing. This shows day 1, 3, and 5 of a conditioning paradigm in which there's a tone CS that starts when the CS goes on, and then just before the CS ends, after 500 milliseconds or half a second, there's an air puff US. And on day 1, you only see the eye blink unconditioned response. It occurs after the US onset. And after day 3, there's a little hint of some anticipation. But by day 5, you see the ramping up of the eye blink, the eye beginning to close prior to the response. And so the eye blink, although both the CR and the UR are eye blink, they differ in timing. The blink that comes before the air puff, before the US, to the left of that line, that's the conditioned response, it's the anticipatory response. The blink that comes after the line is the unconditioned response. We can contrast aversive conditioning with appetitive conditioning when the US is pleasant. You already saw one example in the historical films and recreations of Pavlovian dog conditioning, but what else besides food is innately appealing? Well, sex is one of the things that we and all animals are naturally driven towards, and we can use sex as an appetitive unconditioned stimulus. This is done in the laboratory using quails, and the way the experiment is set up is there will be a male quail in a box that has a light, and there's a door, and in that side compartment is a female. And so exposure to the female, the US, is what innately produces arousal in the male quail. And then the CS is a tone or a light that's initially neutral. And after pairing the CS with the US, the CS comes to produce an approach. So the conditioned response here is that the male quail begins to approach the door where it's expecting the female. So this is a form of appetitive conditioning. It's a new reflex which prepares the animal, the quail, for anticipating access to a female. So let's see if we can test your knowledge of some of these widely used conditioning paradigms. So this is a table. It shows for each of the appetitive paradigms, Pavlov's dog, quail sex, and for the aversive paradigms, we didn't discuss conditioned emotional response. That'll come another time. But eye blink conditioning. And for each one, it shows the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. And I've left out a few. So why don't we go through them, and why don't you test yourself and see if you know. For Pavlov's dog, what is the unconditioned response? The answer is salivation. For the quail sex paradigm, what's the unconditioned stimulus? A sexually available female. So the sexually available female plays the same role as the meat in the Pavlovian conditioning paradigm. Turning to aversive conditioning, in the fly shock, what's the unconditioned response? So that is, what do the flies do naturally when presented with a shock? And the answer is they attempt to escape. And finally, if you're eye blink conditioning, what's the conditioned response? What is it that the animals, the rabbits or the humans, are learning in response to a cue? And the answer is an eye blink. So now, if you were able to sort of get all those, you probably have a good handle on the terminology and the different appetitive and aversive conditioning paradigms. But those are only the laboratory ways in which these classical conditioning is studied. But classical conditioning occurs all throughout our life, all throughout the environment. And so now we're going to have not just a test of your knowledge of what you've learned, but the ability to apply your knowledge to see whether you really understand the concept. So are you sure you can tell the US, the UR, the CS, and CR apart? So I'm going to test yourself by identifying in each of the following real-world situations. And I want you to identify the US, the UR, the CS, the CR, and indicate whether the scenario is an example of appetitive or aversive conditioning. So the first example is a fairly common advertising approach, is an advertisement for a new sports car might show a sexy female model draped over the car's hood. You might ask, why do they do this? Well, think about what's happening in terms of classical conditioning. Do you see a classical conditioning paradigm here? Think for a second. Do you have the CS, the UR, the CS, and the CR? So the US in this case is a female model. The UR is sexual arousal because the target in this case for the sports car is men, heterosexual men. So the idea is that the unconditioned, the natural response to an attractive female model in the male customers, the most male customers, will be a unconditioned response of arousal. The CS that's being paired with the female model is the conditioned stimulus, and the CR is the arousal of pleasurable feelings at the thoughts and sight of the sports car. So the idea is that the sports car, you are being trained by seeing this advertisement over and over again, that the sports car, because it's paired with the female model, the same way that a tone is paired with food, you're being paired to associate it with the kind of pleasurable feelings that you might see in the absence of the female model. So the idea is you want the target customers to experience the same reaction to the car that they would experience to a beautiful female. This is a form of appetitive conditioning because, like with the quail, sexual arousal is the unconditioned response. Here's another example. Mark loves pizza. When he was a boy, his parents frequently had it delivered to their home. Because the pizzas often arrived only lukewarm, his parents would put the pizza still inside the box into the oven to heat up. This caused the box to give off a smell of burning cardboard. Now, years later, whenever Mark smells cardboard burning, he gets hungry for pizza. Do you see the Pavlovian conditioning going on here? Can you identify all the components? Here's the answer. The US, the unconditional stimulus, is hot pizza for dinner. The unconditional response is anticipation of dinner and salivation. Mark would salivate in anticipation of pizza, just like Pavlov's dog would salivate for the meat. The CS is the smell of cardboard burning. Smell of cardboard burning might be a fairly neutral smell. You don't necessarily would associate it with food. But by pairing the smell of cardboard burning with the pizza, Mark develops a conditioned response, hunger pangs and salivation, in response to the smell of cardboard burning. This is a form of appetitive conditioning because, in fact, Mark has an appetite here for the pizza. Now, there's another interesting and important form of conditioning that's called conditioned compensatory response, and it happens as follows. A conditioned compensatory response is a CR, conditioned response, that is the opposite of the UR, and it helps to balance or correct for the US-UR reflex. So you'll notice in the previous examples, the conditioned response was either identical or similar to the unconditioned response. So the dog would salivate in anticipation of food, just like it salivates to the food. There is arousal to the light that goes on for the quail or for the car in the ad. That's the same as the arousal that's associated with a female. But you can also have forms of conditioning where the body's natural response is the opposite to the cue. So, for example, if you inject adrenaline, which is the unconditioned stimulus, the natural unconditioned response is an increase in heart rate. Okay. Now you repeat the procedure in a particular testing chamber. So here the CS is a context. It's a room. It's a place. It's not a particular cue. Now eventually what happens when you put the person in that chamber, you might think, well, will that chamber cause their heart rate to increase? And the answer is no. What happens is exactly the opposite. There's a decrease in heart rate. And the reason is that the body is always trying to maintain, in many, many ways, homeostasis or balance. So the decrease in heart rate that happens when you enter the chamber after you've been given the adrenaline in the chamber many times is your body's way of signaling that it anticipates the adrenaline, it anticipates the heart rate increase, and so it is lowering the rate of heart in anticipation so that when the adrenaline comes, it doesn't take you too high away from the sort of the baseline. We observe this as tolerance, as the testing chamber evokes a CR that weakens the overall effects of the drug. So initially you go in the chamber and you get the adrenaline and you see a big heart rate increase. But every time you go into that familiar chamber and you start to see a decrease in heart rate as a conditioned response that persists through when the adrenaline is presented, and so the adrenaline in a well-experienced participant in this study actually shows less effects of the adrenaline drug. As you might expect, classical conditioning plays an important role in drug tolerance, not just tolerance in this case to adrenaline, but all sorts of drugs. And we'll come back to that at the end of the talk to talk about some of the clinical applications of understanding the mechanisms of conditioned compensatory response in drug responses to drugs of abuse. Earlier I'd mentioned that in addition to acquisition, Pavlov studied extinction. And extinction, as we introduced earlier, is breaking the association between the CS and the US. So it extinguishes the CS-CR reflex. So you present the CS alone repeatedly. Initially, it evokes strong CRs. With repetition, however, the CS becomes less effective, similar to beginning of training. And as we noted before with that schematic that showed spontaneous recovery, extinction probably doesn't erase the CS-US connection because it's able to be recovered in a number of situations. It suggests instead that what's happening in extinction is essentially an inhibition of the acquired response. So it suggests that although acquisition is creating a new response, extinction is actually creating an opponent learning that inhibits the response. So stress, a new context, or just the passage of time can make a CS effective again. This suggests that a classically conditioned memory can survive extinction. So let's stop here and have an interim summary. Classical conditioning starts with an innate reflex. The unconditioned stimulus is associated with an unconditioned response initially and innately. A neutral stimulus is repeatedly presented before the reflex is triggered, building over time a new reflex that helps the organism prepare and anticipate the triggering of an innate reflex. The conditioned stimulus therefore leads to a conditioned response. The standard approaches include both appetitive conditioning, such as the Pavlov dog and quail sex, and aversive conditioning, the eye blink and fly shock forms of conditioning. Classical conditioning gradually builds, with the CS transforming from a neutral to effective cue over many CS-US pairings, although in the forms of some types of aversive conditioning like the shock, that may happen in just one or two trials. The CR and the UR are not exactly the same. Some CRs are actually the opposite of the UR because they are designed to maintain the body's homeostasis, and we call this a conditioned compensatory response. An extinction occurs if the CS is presented alone, but this seems to inhibit the CS-CR response, not erase it. What are the rules of classical conditioning? You might think up till now that classical conditioning is just forming simple associations. Things are either paired or not paired, depending on how often they are shown together. But it turns out that classical conditioning is much more subtle than that, and that, in fact, if you look at some of the many more complicated ways in which conditioning occurs, we begin to realize that animals, even the simplest of animals, are very sophisticated statistical analyzers of their environment, learning what does or doesn't predict an outcome, and what are the most useful ways to predict outcomes. So we're going to describe a couple of paradigms. We're going to look at some of the timing, the ways that timing can be manipulated, a paradigm called blocking, one latent inhibition, and a phenomenon known as associative bias, all of which suggest that there are many subtleties and complexities which will provide us with insights later on to understanding the neural mechanisms that underlie conditioning across species. So remember in the eye blink conditioning, we talked about the CS coming half a second before the US. There are different ways that could happen. The CS can be on the entire time. We're going to talk next about a paradigm called blocking. So blocking occurs in the following situation. We have a control group. A control group is trained to a tone and light CS preceding a shock US. So there's a compound of a tone and a light happening. And then afterwards, both the tone and the light will produce modest responses, in this case, freezing if it's shock for an animal, for a rat. Then we have, this is the control group. So the control group is just seeing this compound conditioning. The pre-trained group, however, is pre-trained first with the light, the CS preceding the shock US, and then the same tone and light CS training as in the control group occurs. So the difference between the control group and the pre-trained group is both of them are getting this tone and light compound training, but the pre-trained group is having one of the cues, the CS, be pre-trained to predict the US. And what we see in the pre-trained group is that afterwards, the light produces a large conditioned response, but the tone produces none. So here's an analogy. Imagine Anne is a fabulous stock analyst. She's a great find. She tells you what the stock market is going to do tomorrow or next week all the time. So Bob is another perfect stock analyst, but you meet him a week after you've hired Anne. Are you going to hire him as well? Well, no, because if Anne is already predicting the stock market for you, Bob doesn't really add any predictive value to your ability. Why should you hire him, in a sense? Why should you pay attention to him? He's redundant with Anne. And so this is essentially the same idea of what's happening in blocking, is you have two cues. They are redundant. They're each predictive of an outcome. But if you are trained initially to recognize that one is the predictor and later on the other one is introduced, you don't pay attention to the other one. You don't learn about them. Or in the case of the stock analyst, you don't hire them. So why is this strange? So let's sort of review. This is the paradigm. There's a control group. In phase one, a rat sits in a chamber. There's no training. In the experimental group, there's that pre-training of a light and a shock. Then both of them get the same phase two, a tone CS and a light CS associated with the US. And then phase three, we test the animal's response to the cues alone. And what we see is that there is a big difference, that pre-training, in this case to the light, means that all of the responding goes to the light. It doesn't get split between the tone and the light. This is despite the fact that both groups have experienced the same association between the tone and the shock. So the tone's relationship with the outcome, the tone's relationship with the shock, is no different in these two situations. So what does this say? This says that the learning that takes place between the tone and the shock isn't context independent. It depends on what else the animal knows, what it's learned before, what else is co-occurring. That to understand what happens when a tone is associated with a shock, we can't just look at the tone and the shock together. We have to see the broader context. Because a prior experience with the light US association blocks learning of the tone US association. This suggests that classical conditioning isn't just about learning associations, it's about tracking information in the environment. When the CS is redundant to what's known, no learning occurs. In the example above, which is the redundant information, which is the redundant cue in the experimental situation is the tone. It's redundant with the light having been associated the same way that the later stock analyst is redundant. Thus, it seems as though internal states, namely what the organism already knows, are required to explain classical conditioning. Here's another intriguing paradigm that it's called latent inhibition. And in latent inhibition, as shown in the table here, there's a control group where the animal just sits in a chamber. And there's an experimental group that's pre-exposed, as in blocking, but in this case it's pre-exposed just to a tone alone. So it's not pre-exposed to a associative paradigm, it's pre-exposed to the tone. And then both groups get a tone air puff conditioning. So you pre-expose to the CS repeatedly in the pre-exposed group. You pair the CS with the US. And what we see is that in the pre-exposed group, there's much less learning going on, okay? So even though both groups had the same number of tone air puff trials, the fact that the tone had been presented alone had later on slowed down or retarded learning to the tone US. This is why it's called latent inhibition, because it's as if the CS-US response has been inhibited by a latent learning that the tone, in this case, is happening irrelevantly. It's not predicting anything in the past. So in other words, another way of thinking of this is the animal has learned that the CS is useless, and in some ways it stopped paying attention. It's made it harder for the animal later on to learn that the CS is in fact a useful predictor of the US. Associative bias refers to the fact that you saw that Pavlov originally thought that any cue could be associated with any outcome, and there is some truth in that, but we and animals have innate preferences for which cues we innately think are likely to be associated with which outcomes. So when a tone and a taste are paired with poison, only the taste will provoke the CR. When a tone and a taste are paired with shock, only the tone predicts the CR. So this suggests that in nature, Tastes tend to go with getting sick. You eat a certain food and it's gone bad and you get sick. You avoid things that taste that in the future. Sounds tend to be associated with getting hurt. When we hear a sound, when we've been hurt, we tend to think about what are the things we've heard immediately before we got hurt. So it suggests that there are these innate preferences for forming associations that can override statistical correlations. So these last few slides have all suggested ways in which learning is much more complex. Classical conditioning is much more complex than just simple associative learning. And to understand this complexity, to understand the algorithms for learning, psychologists have developed models of classical conditioning. And these models are theories that describe how and where and when learning is going to take place. And these models, although they took place initially just in the context of psychology and behavior, later turned out to be incredibly important as theoretical guides to inform the search for neural substrates. Timing effects, blocking, latent inhibition, and associative bias show that the rules for classical conditioning are quite complex. And so researchers turn to these models of classical conditioning, formal sets of rules, mathematical models for when learning will occur. The hope is that a simple model will be able to explain the complexity of classical conditioning, and a mismatch between model and data will provide clues to what we still need to understand. There have been two popular traditions in models of classical conditioning. One that are called U.S. modulation approaches, in which learning changes the processing of the U.S., the most prominent is the Rescorla-Wagner, and other theories that have looked at C.S. modulation approaches, in which learning changes the processing of the U.S., the attention to the U.S., and the model most often referred to in that context is Macintosh. Overall, the Rescorla-Wagner, both of them account for different sets of data. They both have things that they can account for, but the other models can't, suggesting that each of them captures something that's happening in the brain. But overall, it's the Rescorla-Wagner model which had the much larger effect on the field. And so we're going to spend some time focusing on understanding the Rescorla-Wagner model, because the Rescorla-Wagner model that really led to some pretty important insights into the neural substrates of learning. The Rescorla-Wagner model is called an error correction learning. The model predicts the conditioned response strength on a trial to trial. The CR strength increases, but less and less on each trial. There's a negative acceleration. And this is because the model conceives of learning as happening based on prediction error, the difference between a subject's expectation of a US and whether the US actually occurs. So there's a difference going on. You have the expectation of the U.S., in this case the air puff or eye blink conditioning, and whether the U.S. actually occurs. Initially, there's no expectation of the U.S. So let's look at the three different situations. There's initially the CS predicts nothing, and then an unexpected U.S. occurs. We consider that to be a positive error. It leads to a positive increase in association. When the CS fully predicts the U.S. and the predicted U.S. occurs, there's no error. You've predicted, it occurs, and you don't expect, therefore, no learning, because learning isn't driven in the Rescorla-Wagner model by pairing and association. It's driven by error. It's driven by a discrepancy in what you expected from what actually occurs. Now, in extinction, remember, the CS predicts the U.S. The dog may salivate to the food, salivate to the bell, even though the food is no longer going to be presented, and no U.S. occurs. Well, in this case, it's considered to be a negative prediction error. You predict something, but nothing happens. And here we see a decrease in association. What's that decrease in association resulting in behaviorally? The answer is that's extinction. So it's negative error, which drives extinction. It's positive error, which drives acquisition. So in the Rescorla-Wagner model, it's a mathematical model. Each QCS, such as a tone, has an association weight that indicates the probability that the CS predicts the US. This association weight increases from acquisition trial to acquisition trial, but it's a progressively smaller change. Why is it a smaller and smaller change? Because the error is getting smaller and smaller on a tone shock or tone air puff training. This model is called an error correction rule. It has much in common with many engineering algorithms, and more recently with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms, because it's designed to reduce the error over many trials. The paradigm that really led most strongly to Rescorla and Wagner developing this model is the blocking paradigm that we described earlier. Control condition, remember, learn a compound conditioning of light and tone in phase 2, and then in phase 3 they responded equally to both. The pre-trained rats are conditioned to the light in phase 1, and then in phase 2 they continue to respond to the light, even though the tone was presented with it. But in phase 3 they responded to the light but not the tone. So this shows some graphs that describes what I just said. So in phase 1, in the control. So the top two graphs show the control condition. So in phase 1, there's no training, and the weights for the tone and the light. So we have a weight for the tone, a weight for the light, and the expectation is the sum of the weights for all the cues that are present. So that's all 0 when nothing is happening. In the control condition for the light and tone together, we see both the light and the tone are rising together till a value of 50, but the expected US is double that, okay, because it's those both cues are present, the light and the tone, and the sum of the two of them leads to ultimately learning that goes up to 100, which in this case is considered to be the maximal learning. This contrasts with what's happened in the blocking in the pre-trained condition, where the light is paired with the US over and over again, only the light, so that the weight of the tone stays at 0, that's the lower left graph, but the weight of the light cue goes all the way up to 100. Later on in phase 2, although the light and the tone are paired together, there's no error, and therefore there's no error to drive increases in learning to the tone, and there's no error needed to keep the expected US at 100. So that's the basic way in which this Rescorla-Wagner error correction model is explaining blocking. Let's take a look at it from a slightly more mathematical perspective in the following video.
So let's take a look at the outline for this video. We're going to be covering what the Rescorla-Wagner model of classical conditioning is. We're going to be looking at a laboratory example using lab rats, and then we're going to look at a more applied example using something you might expect in the real world, and then we'll cap it off by talking about why this model is important, why it's being taught to you, and why you should know about it. So let's take a step back and let's look at the equation. Oh, there it is in all of its scary glory. Let's focus right now on this outcome variable, this thing at the end, the delta VA. What that is going to be a measurement of how much you have learned about a certain stimulus. We can call it stimulus A, but it can be whatever you want it to be. So we're looking at how much has changed with a new trial. So that's delta VA. Let's look at another parameter. Let's look at this next one, this alpha A right here. What this is going to be the saliency of stimulus A. So we're going to be basically looking at the associative value of whatever conditioned stimulus we're talking about in this example. Next, we have beta R, and beta R is going to be kind of like an intensity value. So it's an intensity value of the unconditioned stimulus or of the reinforcer. If you want to apply this to operant conditioning, that's fine. And then this thing that we have down here in the parentheses, that's going to be the upper limit of the associative value of the unconditioned stimulus. So basically, how much can you possibly learn from it? Because not every stimulus is created equal, as you already know. And we will learn to calculate these in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you about the secret to the Rescorla-Wagner model, which is that learning is all about surprise. In other words, when we learn something, we're surprised by it. But if what happens is exactly what we expect, then we don't necessarily learn as much. So we need that surprise in order to learn stuff. So let's take a quick look at a basic conditioning example involving a simple lab rat. And this is going to be a fear conditioning study. It's going to be very simple, very straightforward. And the question is, what predicts a mild electric shock? Is it a buzzing sound or is it a red light? So we have these two neutral stimuli that we're going to see whether or not they are conditioned stimuli for this element of fear. So we're going to focus on this light right here and this speaker right here. So keep an eye on those things, and we're going to see which of these two stimuli is going to predict an electric shock for this rat. I'm going to call this rat, I'm going to call him Maestro. So right now, we don't know what to expect. And so we're going to say that the V1 for the light and the V2 for the speaker are both set to 0. We don't expect any kind of learning from them. Now we have the red light going off, and oh, Maestro has been shocked. So Maestro is surprised, right? Maestro is surprised because he's learned now that the red light is equal to shock. So we're going to move this stimulus value up to a V1. In other words, the prediction was no pain, but the outcome was pain, so we have error in the model, and we need to recalculate V1 to be 1. The red light goes off one more time, and he gets shocked again. Now, Maestro is not really all that surprised because he's already learned that the red light means that he's going to be shocked. So V1 is still going to be 1, and V2 is going to be 0. So the prediction was pain, the outcome was pain. There's no error in our model. But let's change it up a little bit. Let's say that this third trial, the speaker comes on, but the light doesn't. In this case, Maestro is just wondering, hey, who cares, right? Because it doesn't look like the tone is going to predict the shock, and so he hasn't really learned anything. These values are going to be unchanged. So when we look at our model, we predicted no pain, and the outcome was no pain, which is great. Let's look at the fourth trial here. So in this fourth trial, he gets shocked without any kind of warning. And so he's thinking, this is weird because I feel like I should have seen that light if I was going to get shocked. So we're going to readjust this value a little bit. And now it's time for us to recalculate the associative value of that red light. Now it's at 0.75 instead of just 1.0. Now let's say that the red light and the speaker both come on, and hey, Maestro gets shocked again. Now Maestro is going to learn a little bit here. He's going to learn that the light is a little bit more predictive of that shock, but he's not going to learn anything about that speaker, and this is called blocking, which is a fancy way of saying that basically Maestro has not learned that the speaker has any predictive value of whether or not he's going to be in pain. Okay, so let's look at a real world example, and I want you to consider your least favorite professor, and they are your least favorite professor because they keep assigning you pop quizzes. The question though is, can you predict when a quiz is coming? So let's lay it all out here. First, we have our possible predictors. Maybe he frowns when he enters the class, he doesn't have coffee, or he's carrying a bag of papers. The outcome is going to be, is there a quiz? And now we have kind of this setup where we're going to be looking at the error involved based on our prediction and the actual outcome. Okay, so let's look at the first day of class. So on the first day, we notice that he's frowning when he enters the class. So the question is, what do we expect? Well, we don't have any prior experience, so we're going to say no quiz, which means that this stimulus value is going to be 0, and the outcome actually is no quiz. And so if we're looking at how this impacts our model, our prediction was no quiz, and our outcome was no quiz, which basically means that the stimulus value, V1, can stay at 0. So let's take a look at the second day now. You notice that he doesn't have any coffee. So what do you expect? You don't really expect anything because you have no prior experience with this. So V2 is going to be 0, but oh god, he had a quiz. Crap. So this means that we have error in the model because our prediction was different from the actual outcome. What we predicted was no quiz. Our outcome was that we did get a quiz, which means that we need to recalculate V2 to be 1.0. So the third day, we have frowning when he enters the class. He doesn't have coffee. So what do we expect here? We expect that there's going to be a quiz because of this V2 is equal to 1. And so the outcome is, yes, there is a quiz. So there is no error in our model because we predicted a quiz and the outcome was a quiz, which means that V1 and V2 are going to stay exactly the same. Now let's fast forward to day 4. And on this day, all 3 possible predictors are here. What do we expect? We do expect a quiz because he doesn't have coffee, and yes, we're right, so there's no error in our model. We predicted a quiz, the outcome was there was a quiz, but what if the real reason we had a quiz was because he was carrying a stack of papers? Well, this leads us back into blocking, which means that we don't actually learn that carrying that stack of papers actually matters. So looking at the 5th day, we can see that he's frowning when he enters the class. He doesn't have coffee, so we expect there to be a quiz, but oh, there's no quiz, which means that we do have error in this model and we need to recalibrate V2. So our prediction was a quiz and outcome was no quiz, which means that we have error in our model and we need to recalculate the stimulus value for that. So let's get back to basics and let's look at how the Rescorla-Wagner model actually focuses in on this V2, on the fact that there is coffee involved. So let's apply this example to this equation, and we can see how this works. So let's focus on alpha 2 here. So we're looking at how salient is the presence of coffee involved here. So how noticeable is it? Now let's look at the result variable, so delta V2. Basically, we're looking at how predictive is the coffee. Does it change? Is it more predictive or less predictive as a result of that particular day? Beta R is going to be the intensity of the quiz, because in this case we're kind of treating the quiz as it's like an unconditioned stimulus because it makes us feel unpleasant. And then this parenthetical statement is going to be the top limit on how predictive that quiz can possibly be under the best circumstances. But if you're still upset that you have to learn about this, you can blame these two guys, Robert Rescorla and Alan Wagner. This comes out of their work from the 70s, and this was a super popular model at the time, and it still is because it is very reliable and is very predictive of different kinds of behavior, especially associative learning. And because it predicts blocking, which at the time was a huge problem for learning scientists trying to find a way to accurately predict when blocking was going to occur. But this isn't the end of the story. People are still using the Rescorla-Wagner model, and it looks like it even has a neural basis in our dopamine pathways. These pathways, which are located in the middle of the brain, in the midbrain, seem to calibrate themselves based on the same error prediction that we just went through at trying to learn how predictive certain outcomes are. But the Rescorla-Wagner model isn't perfect. It does have a couple limitations, and they have been kind of revised in the subsequent years. One of these is that it doesn't really account for latent inhibition, which is whenever previous experience with stimuli kind of inhibits your ability to learn or to learn to predict certain outcomes. It doesn't really account for spontaneous recovery, which is whenever a conditioned response seems to come back after extinction. It doesn't really account for reacquisition or savings that you get from learning. So, for example, if you have learned something and then you quote-unquote forgot it, you might be faster at picking up or learning that association the second time around. And it doesn't really account for sensory preconditioning, which is whenever you learn things that are paired before any kind of conditioning takes place, and this model doesn't really account for that. All right, so that's it. That's the basic overview of the Rescorla-Wagner model of classical conditioning. This nasty equation right here, just keep in mind that it is all about surprise, that surprise equals learning. So if this video was not helpful for you, then we would say that delta VA is equal to 0. All right, that's all that we have time for. Bye.
So the influence of the Rescorla-Wagner model was pervasive in both psychology, in engineering, and in neuroscience. It explained previously puzzling results. It allowed researchers to make predictions that couldn't be made previously. But as noted in the video, it cannot account for every kind of learning. It was a useful starting point. As I mentioned, there is another class of models by McIntosh that focused not on modulating how surprising the US for driving areas, but how the CS is processed. And the McIntosh model suggested that stimuli have a salience that determines attention, and that repeated exposure with no consequence decreases salience, essentially a form of habituation, and that in things like latent inhibition, which the Rescorla-Wagner cannot account for, pre-exposure to the CS decreases attention for that stimulus, making it hard to learn about in the training phase. Attempts have been made to integrate both the CS-focused, the McIntosh, and the US-focused, or Rescorla-Wagner model approaches, and some of these models have provided some suggestions for how different brain systems can come together, and we'll come back to that later. So let's take a pause for a second and look at some of the summary of what we've learned. Classical conditioning is not as simple as just pairing a CS with a US. Timing is important. The CS must precede the US, but not by too long of a delay. Blocking, the CS must provide new information about the US. Latent inhibition, the CS must be attended to. Associative bias, the CS must meet innate expectations for possible pairing with the US. Several models have been proposed to account for the complexity of classical conditioning. The Rescorla-Wagner model proposes that learning is a function of errors of prediction, with classical conditioning occurring when a CS helps make useful predictions about the future occurrence of a US. Attentional or CS-focused models like McIntosh propose that conditioning is partly a function of the salience of the CS, how much is attended to, and some models have attempted to integrate these approaches. We'll talk now about the brain substrates of classical conditioning, building on the behavioral processes that were described previously, and especially on these mathematical models of conditioning. Since Pavlov, there's been a keen interest in understanding how classical conditioning works at the neural level. In the 1980s, Richard Thompson and associates discovered that eye blink conditioning in rabbits, the paradigm that was introduced earlier, depends on the cerebellum. Since then, Thompson's lab worked out considerable detail on how the cerebellum supports classical conditioning. We'll turn now and let Thompson show you a little bit about what he had discovered.
Thompson has succeeded in finding one of the memory engrams by tracing the circuitry of the brain involved in conditioning and remembering.
The first goal of the research has been to localize where the memories are stored in the brain. We selected a very simple form of learning, classical conditioning, first developed by Pavlov in Russia, as a model system in which to study where memories are stored. So we mapped through the brain, recording the activity, the electrical activity of nerve cells, looking for places in the brain where the nerve cells generate potentials that relate to the actual learned behavior. What we are showing here is a standard eyelid conditioning experiment using rabbits as subjects. We present a relatively mild neutral stimulus, a tone or a light. We then follow that with a puff of air to the eye, and that, of course, elicits a reflex blink of the eye. And we have just a device hooked up to record the eyelid closure response and a little tube that conducts the puff of air to the eye. With a number of pairings of these two stimuli together, the animal develops a conditioned response, a learned response, a memory, if you will, so that it blinks to the tone before the air puff occurs. After the animal has been trained, we will then make a very small lesion in the region that we think contains the memory trace, and that very small lesion will abolish permanently the memory for this conditioned response. The memory traces for these learned responses that we study appear to be stored in very localized regions right here in this little structure within the cerebellum called the interpositus nucleus. Now, the lesion that abolishes the learned eyelid response is the lesion right here. It takes out no more than a cubic millimeter of tissue. In fact, we can abolish any learned discrete movement by a tiny lesion in the appropriate place within this interpositus nucleus. What I'm going to show on the computer face now is a response of the animal early in training, before the animal has learned the conditioned response. This is a recording of the eyelid response itself. So time is going this way, tone comes on, and there's no response at all to the tone. Air puff to the eye, a reflex eye blink, eye closure, strictly a reflex before learning has occurred. This is a well-learned conditioned response by an animal that's been well-trained before surgery has been done. The tone comes on at this point in time, and you'll notice that there is a very well-developed eyelid closure response that peaks about the time of onset of the air puff. There is then a reflex response to the air puff itself. This is the conditioned response. After the surgery, we can see that the memory for the learned response is completely obliterated. All that's left is the reflex response, the same response the animal gave at the beginning of training before it had learned a conditioned response. Destroying that tissue permanently abolished the memory for the learned response. The animal could never learn that response again. We can now go after the actual physical chemical processes that are involved in the storage of this kind of memory. So we feel that as we come to understand how the brain stores memories, we will be able to develop new techniques and new tools to deal with memory disorders. So that's a very practical and I think now realizable goal.
So let's review here the circuitry that Thompson was describing. What you see on the right is a schematic of the stimuli at the bottom, the brain stem where information is coming in, the deep cerebellar nuclei is the middle level, and the cerebellar cortex at top. So let's follow the CS input pathway where the tone or the light information comes in. It goes in first to the pontine nuclei in the brain stem, and then it follows mossy fibers up into the deep nuclei, some of which go off into the interpositus nucleus, shown there as the circle in right, and others which continue onward, outward, in this case, to the cerebellum. The US input pathway, the airput information, comes in first through the inferior olive, and then from the inferior olive, the fibers split, where again, some go to the interpositus and the cerebellar deep nuclei, and others go up to the Purkinje cells in the cortex. And so what you see here, what's most important to note is that there are two places in the cerebellum where CS information and US information come together. One is at the interpositus, and the other is in the cerebellar cortex, particularly at the Purkinje cells. So turning to the output pathway, the Purkinje cells of the cerebellar cortex collect both CS and US input, one of the two places where that occurs. It then inhibits the output neuron of the interpositus nucleus, the other point of conversion, which in turn activates the CR. So the Purkinje cells are one site of learning. That then inhibits the interpositus, which is another site of learning, and the interpositus then does two things. One is it outputs to the eye blink response, the motor response, but it also goes back and inhibits the inferior olive. The interpositus in this way can generate CRs, conditioned responses, the blink to the tone, but it's important to note that the interpositus is not involved in the unconditioned response. It's not involved in generating the blink to the air puff. So, as noted, the CS-US association has to be stored someplace where the CS and US information come together. These are two, the Purkinje cells in the cerebellar cortex and the interpositus nucleus are the two places where they could be stored. And recordings from the cerebellum before and after learning have helped demonstrate where the memory is stored. The next slide shows recordings from the cerebellum, in this case the Purkinje cells. And what you see is that that Purkinje cells have a background firing that goes on. And what happens in a well-trained animal is that it doesn't respond so much to the tone, CS, not then, but that at the point of the air puff, US, the Purkinje cells begin to shut off. So it looks like it's the opposite of the conditioned response. But remember, the Purkinje cells are inhibiting the interpositus nucleus so that this shutting off of the Purkinje cells creates an opportunity to release the interpositus to fire and therefore control the response. Brain stimulation can be used in place of actual stimuli in the environment. Since the CSs activate sensory nuclei of the pontine nuclei, researchers paired direct stimulation of this nucleus electrophysiologically with an air puff and showed that they could get learning that was just as normal as in regular learning with a real air puff. And with a real cue. And even more amazingly, once they had trained an animal using the electrophysiological stimulation of the inferior olive, then a real CS, a tone, could then activate the CR. In a sense, the physiologist wrote a memory into the brain without the rabbit, in this case, ever experiencing the actual tone air puff pairing. Conditioning is impaired when the cerebellum is damaged. The CR's output pathway is the interpositus nucleus of the cerebellum, and even small interpositus lesions destroy and prevent CRs, although they won't destroy the unconditioned response. In contrast, lesions in the cerebellar cortex, including the Purkinje cells, affect the timing of CR learning, and this is consistent with studies seen in autistic children who have disruptions in their cerebellar cortex. They learn conditioning, but they're poorly timed responses. Let's go back to the model of conditioning we described before, the Rescorla-Wagner model. It proposes that errors of prediction drive learning. Now, how could these errors be calculated within the neurons? Remember from the description of the algorithm that learning is a difference score, a difference between the actual US and the expected US. And we see a neural mechanism for computing this in the inhibitory pathway between the interpositus and the air puff olive. So the interpositus conveys the conditioned response, which is in fact the anticipation, the expectation, and the air puff to the US is carrying information about the actual outcome. And so the Rescorla-Wagner model says there should be a difference calculation between these two, and that error between them should be what's driving learning. And in fact, what we see is exactly that. It suggests that the inferior olive isn't just simply conveying information about the air puff, is actually conveying information about the degree to which the air puff is unexpected, because the more the interpositus predicts the air puff, then the less the inferior olive will fire. So it suggests the inferior olive is actually carrying error signal. And so with training, the CS comes to evoke inhibition in the inferior olive, and so we should see less and less inferior olive activation. That is, so net activity in the inferior olive reflects actual, less expected, that is, CS-evoked inhibition. Here's some additional evidence. Activity in the inferior olive follows the error term in the Rescorla-Wagner model, strong early in training, but greatly reduced by the end of training, when the CS enables a strong expectation of the US. More strikingly, blocking the CS-evoked inhibition blocks blocking, disables the reduction in error during phase 1, enabling full learning to both CSs during phase 2. That is, if you chemically block that inhibitory pathway from the interpositus to the inferior olive, what happens is blocking disappears and the rabbit will learn about the previously trained cue because there's no longer any reduction in the inferior olive firing, no longer an error term that is modulated by expectation or surprise. So let's test your knowledge on the cerebellar anatomy. It's important to be able to identify and refer to these structures. We'll start with the top one. This is which cell? The Purkinje cell. The middle one is the interpositus, and at the bottom is the inferior olive. So let's test some of your other knowledge about the functioning of this circuit. What's the role of the Purkinje cell in the cerebellar cortex? Discuss the evidence that suggests this. The Purkinje cell is involved in response timing. The evidence includes findings that lesions of the cerebellar cortex lead to smaller and poorly timed CRs, and that mice with degeneration of Purkinje cells are slow to learn eye blink conditioning. What are the two main cerebellar regions and the major sensory input pathways to the cerebellum? Where do these two pathways in the cerebellum converge? There are two main cerebellar regions, are the cerebellar cortex containing the Purkinje cells and the cerebellar deep nuclei. The major sensory input pathway to the cerebellum are the CS pathways and the US input pathway. The two sites of convergence are the Purkinje cells and the interpositus nucleus. 3. How do electrophysiological recordings in the rabbit cerebellum during classical conditioning demonstrate that the cerebellum is responsible for unconditioned responses and not for unconditioned responses? I'm sorry, let me repeat that. How do electrophysiological recordings in the rabbit cerebellum during classical conditioning demonstrate that the cerebellum is responsible for conditioned responses, that is the CR, and not for unconditioned responses, that is the UR? The answer is that researchers recorded unpaired CS or US alone trials in naive rabbits. They found that where there is no CR, there is no activity in the interpositus nucleus. This is despite the fact that a strong eye blink during the US alone trials, there was a lack of interpositus activity. Let's talk now about the hippocampus. And the hippocampus seems to be involved in CS modulation, in capturing some of the concepts that we described earlier in terms of these Macintosh models. And in fact, the removal of the hippocampus doesn't alter the basic classical conditioning paradigm, but it does eliminate behaviors like latent inhibition, which the Rescorla-Wagner model doesn't account for. And it also disrupts other paradigms that depend on changes in the processing of the CS. So what does this mean? It suggests that the US modulation that Rescorla-Wagner described in their mathematical model of conditioning captures what the cerebellum is doing in eye blink conditioning, while CS modulation, as described by Macintosh's model, describes the mechanisms that occur in the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe. Another important brain component of conditioning, and particularly eye blink conditioning, is the brain rhythms. So hippocampal theta waves are present during learning and REM sleep, and they may facilitate memory storage. Rabbits whose eye blink conditioning trials were triggered by theta activity learn much faster than a control group. So it suggests that when the training is occurring with theta rhythm, that the animals are learning much faster, and this provides an insight into a whole other way of trying to understand what are some of the ways in which the brain systems are being activated and what strengthens or weakens memory. In the discussion so far about the brain substrates of classical conditioning in the rabbit eye blink conditioning paradigm, we've talked about the emergence of theories and an understanding of how this learning occurs at the circuit level. But to dig deeper, to get at what's happening at the cellular level, within the neurons, within the neurotransmitters, we need to move down the phylogenetic scale to look at invertebrates. And some of the most important work in this area has been done by Eric Kandel, who won a Nobel Prize for his studies of the cellular bases of learning in the aplysia. And I'm going to turn over now to let him tell you about this in a lecture he gave at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute.
Behaviors. But we have selected the simplest behavior that the simple animal has. What we look at is a withdrawal of the gill. This is an external respiratory organ, which it lies in a mantle shelf, which is normally perfused by seawater, and the gill extracts oxygen from the seawater. It's covered by the mantle shelf, a piece of skin that we've pulled back here in this drawing. That mantle shelf ends in a fleshy spout called the siphon. If you now apply a weak tactile stimulus to the siphon, like that, you get a withdrawal of the gill. This very simple reflex can be modified not by one, not by two, but by several different forms of learning. Sensitization, habituation, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. I want to remind you, these are the behaviors that the behaviorists, the initial students of behavior, studied. So Pavlov and Thorndike, this is what they were studying. They were studying all forms of implicit memory, and we can see this in the simplest animal. Each of these forms of learning has a short-term and a long-term memory, depending on repetition. I'm going to focus on one form of learning called sensitization, a form of learned fear. So if a horrible noise were to go off in the corner of this room, it would startle the heck out of all of us. As a result of it, most of us, me particularly, would be very nervous, so a modest stimulus that would have no effect at all would startle me. And so with learned fear in aplysia. If you apply a noxious tactile stimulus to the tail, you frighten the animal. It has learned that it's frightened, and now when you apply the same gentle stimulus to the siphon, you get a much brisker withdrawal than you saw before. Let's see this in the real animal. So we're looking at an aplysia stretched out. We're going to focus in on the gill and the siphon. We're going to apply an extremely weak stimulus so you can see the amplification with sensitization. Weak stimulus to the siphon, you see a modest withdrawal of the gill. Now we're going to frighten the animal, startle it, give a noxious stimulus to the tail. That, of course, causes a contraction in its own right. This contraction lasts for seconds, but you can come back minutes later. The same siphon stimulus now produces a much more powerful withdrawal. We can now compare the two, normal and sensitized, and see how much more powerful the withdrawal is in the animal that is startled. The memory for this event is a function of number of training trials. So if you give a single tail shock, plotting here, change in reflex strength is a function of time, the enhancement of the reflex lasts minutes. But if we give the same stimulus 4 or 5 times, we get a memory that lasts a couple of days. So we have a short-term memory and a long-term memory, and we can now look at the difference between them. We know from other experiments, more complicated cases, that protein synthesis inhibitors block long-term memory. So we can see, will that work in this simple case as well? You apply an inhibitor of protein synthesis, inject it into the animal, or apply it to the abdominal ganglion, which controls this behavior. You selectively block the long-term process without in any way interfering with the short-term process. Moreover, this memory that I showed you lasts for a few days. If you train for several days, you can get a memory that lasts for weeks. So you can really, in some detail, compare short-term to long-term memory. So what we next want to understand is, how does this reflect itself in the neural circuitry of behavior? Can we begin to get to the level that Tom was talking about? So in Aplysia, one can look at identified cells, see specific neurons and how they interconnect with one another, and we can work out the reflex architecture, the mediating circuit of the reflex. And I've simplified it for you, but there are 24 sensory neurons. They innervate 6 motor neurons. And the sensory neurons also interconnect with inhibitory and excitatory interneuron, the middle managements that Tom mentioned to you. The sensory neurons pick up directly from the siphon skin. They make direct connections to the motor neurons that move the gill. So this is the monosynaptic reflex of the kind that Tom talked about. So we looked at this form of learning that we talked about earlier, sensitization, to see what happens to the reflex architecture when the animal learns. We found that when you stimulate the tail, you activate modulatory systems in the nervous system of Aplysia that release serotonin. The serotonin is a small molecule that acts to affect the strength of synaptic connections between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. Let's look at this in some detail. What happens if you give a single tail shock? If you give a single tail shock, you strengthen the connections between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons transiently. This is a functional change. You do not see any anatomical change in the connections. But if you give a repeated tail shock, you actually get a growth of new synaptic connections. So if you remember anything about Tom Jessel's lecture, it is because an anatomical change has occurred in your brain that allows you to remember this for long periods of time. In fact, one can argue that the whole function of a series of holiday lectures is to allow you to walk out of this room with a somewhat different brain than you walked into this room with, as a result of the growth of new synaptic connections. So this tells us 2 interesting things. One is that although genetic and developmental programs specify the basic mediating architecture of behavior, they don't specify the exact strength. The strength can be modified by various forms of learning. I've shown you a form of learning in which the strength is enhanced. In other forms of learning, like habituation, the strength is decreased, number 1. Number 2, it tells you that the synapse has a double function. It is not simply the site of communication. It is also a site for learning and memory storage. Now, we've looked at the reflex that is simple, and we've looked at a neural circuit that is simple. But we want to go all the way. We really want to drive this analysis into the ground. And for that, we want to make our task even simpler. We don't want to deal with 24 sensory neurons. We don't want to deal with 6 motor neurons, several serotonergic cells. We want to see whether we can reduce the complexity even more. We want to see whether we can take a radical reductionist approach to the study of learning and memory. So let's see if we can take a single sensory neuron, a single motor neuron, and a single serotonergic neuron and put it in a dish. And we can do that. Sensory neuron on top forms perfectly good connections with the motor neurons, and the serotonergic cells, the modular neurons, form connections onto them. And if you stimulate the modulatory neurons, you'll strengthen the connections between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. But we don't even need the modulatory neurons. We know they release serotonin. So we can substitute a pipette that simply puffs on serotonin. We now have a learning circuit, a 2-neuron learning circuit in a dish, and we can now puff on serotonin. And we can see what happens. If we puff on serotonin once, we get a transient facilitation of synaptic strength. We're now looking at the amplitude of synaptic strength as a function of time. Lasts minutes. If we now give 5 puffs, brief puffs of serotonin, we get a facilitation that lasts more than 1 day. And now we can ask something very nice. We saw that long-term memory differs from short-term memory in requiring the synthesis of new proteins. Is this represented at the elementary level? Can you see this at the connection between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron? And we can obviously do this very simply. We can apply inhibitors of protein synthesis, and we find that it selectively blocks the long-term without in any way affecting the short-term process. So here we have a situation in which we reduce the learning process, a component of it, a critical component of it, to a monosynaptic connection consisting of literally 2 cells and a puff of pipette. And we can now try to analyze the molecular mechanisms that underlie it. So I'm going to show you a blow-up of the sensory neuron and the motor neuron and the serotonergic modulatory inputs. So sensory neuron is on top, motor neuron is at the bottom. On the left-hand side, you see the tail-activating serotonergic cells. Let's look at the basal condition. In the absence of tail stimulation, we generate an action potential in the sensory neurons. As Tom Jessel pointed out in his lecture, that propagates to the presynaptic terminal. It opens up calcium channels, allows calcium to come into the presynaptic terminal, and calcium is absolutely required for the exocytotic release of transmitter. It allows vesicles to bind and to be released. What happens if we now stimulate the tail? We activate serotonergic cells. These release serotonin. Serotonin is recognized by a serotonergic receptor in the presynaptic sensory neurons. These engage an enzyme called an adenyl cyclase that converts ATP to cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is a second messenger. There are lots of different second messengers. They all have the same function. They carry information from the membrane surface to the molecular machinery inside the cell. Cyclic AMP activates a particular molecular machine called the cyclic AMP-dependent protein kinase. That is abbreviated protein kinase A, pKa. Cyclic AMP-dependent protein kinase has 2 subunits, a regulatory subunit and a catalytic subunit. I've indicated the regulatory subunit as a spindle-shaped structure and the catalytic subunit as a oval-shaped structure. The regulatory subunit inhibits the catalytic subunit under normal circumstances. When the level of cyclic AMP rises, the regulatory subunit binds cyclic AMP, undergoes a conformational change, frees the catalytic subunit. It now can move into the presynaptic terminal. It acts on ion channels. It phosphorylates them, alters their properties, allows calcium to come into the presynaptic terminal. So now an action potential has more calcium coming in, more vesicles can bind, more vesicles can be released, and you have enhanced transmitter release. And that is the mechanism of short-term memory for synaptic facilitation. And this is occurring at every single sensory neuron that is involved in the reflex. What about long-term memory? When we give repeated tail shock, we activate the serotonergic cells more. They release more serotonin, increases the level of cyclic AMP more, activates the cyclic AMP-dependent protein kinase more persistently. So now the cyclic AMP-dependent protein kinase can do two jobs, not just one. Number one, it goes to the presynaptic terminal where it enhances transmitter release as it did in the short term. But now it does something very interestingly. The catalytic subunit moves into the nucleus. So one of the reasons you need repeated training is to allow second messenger kinases to move into the nucleus. And there they activate transcription. They act on a transcription factor, and Tom told you what transcription factors are. They're proteins that bind to specific sequences in DNA. This transcription factor is called CREB, cyclic AMP response element binding protein. And it binds to a sequence in DNA called the CRE, cyclic AMP response element. When it becomes phosphorylated by pKa, it can bind to that sequence, activate genes, and these give rise to the growth of new synaptic connections. And it's the growth of new synaptic connections that is the maintained form of memory storage. This growth is what is responsible for the maintained strength of synaptic connections. And if you leave this room remembering Tom's lecture, you will actually have an anatomical change as a result of this. So there are two really interesting things that I want you to think about. The first is that long-term memory differs from short-term memory in involving the expression of genes, altering gene expression. Now, you heard from Tom, and we generally think of genes as being the controllers of behavior, the determinants of behavior, and that is true. They're extremely important. But what is not also appreciated is that genes are also the servants of the environment. They respond to environmental contingencies. So when you interact with each other for a long period of time and affect each other's behavior, you are producing alterations in gene expression. And gene expression is particularly important because it is the gene expression that gives rise to the growth of new synaptic connections. The gene products that are produced are responsible for the growth of new synaptic connections, and they're absolutely required for that. If you block CREB, you don't get a long-term memory. You don't get a growth of new synaptic connections. Now, what are the kinds of proteins that are required here? Well, two of the proteins that are required are neurexin in the presynaptic neuron and neuroligin in the postsynaptic cell. Have we heard about these before? Yes. Tom brought them in as being zippers, important in developmental synapse formation. And these studies show they're also important in the new growth associated with learning. And that suggests the possibility that one of the things that is defective in autism, in which these particular genes mutated in certain individuals, is that they lack the capability to learn certain aspects of social interaction. In Aplysia, the growth is really quite dramatic. So this is a sensory neuron. He is a motor neuron before learning.
So to summarize, Kandel is talking about the molecular and cellular bases of learning, but it's important to note that he's talking about a non-associative form of learning, sensitization. There's no classical conditioning going on here, but the important thing that he showed here for sensitization, this simple non-associative responding to stimuli, is that there are two separate components. There's the short-term component, and there's the long-term component, and they have separate molecular mechanisms, separate things that are going on in the cell, and that there are these genetic transcription components of the long-term memory, which involves a physical change in the neuron. Now, the next stage of Kandel's work was to show that these same basic cellular mechanisms for sensitization, the non-associative form of learning, were the basis for classical conditioning, that when you introduce another stimulus, when you introduce a correlation between one cue and another cue, that is going to create a stimulus-specific form of learning. But really the beauty of his work was to show that the cellular and molecular mechanisms of classical conditioning build on the cellular and molecular mechanisms of non-associative learning, of sensitization. So let's just review some of what we learned from Kandel. They demonstrated that activation of a sensory neuron in the Aplysia siphon has at least three consequences. First, it causes the motor neuron to fire by the release of the neurotransmitter glutamate into the synapse. Second, it causes a decrease in glutamate vesicles available for any subsequent stimulation in the sensory neuron, resulting in habituation. Habituation is another form of non-associative learning. It's a resulting decrease in responding to a cue, as opposed to sensitization, which is a non-associative increase in responding to cues. And third, the activation of the sensory neuron primes the synapse through a series of intracellular events lasting about half a second, such that subsequent presence there of the neurotransmitter serotonin, which is released following activation of an aversive tail shock, creates an increase in future glutamate release. As I mentioned, Kendall took this basic cellular and molecular story about separate short-term and long-term changes for non-associative sensitization and showed how they could be the basis for classical conditioning in the aplysia. So the aplesia's gill withdrawal reflex can be classically conditioned. Initially, the CS is a light touch to the siphon, initially producing little to no withdrawal. The US and the US are the tail shock that creates a strong gill withdrawal reflex. And the training involves the CS and the US pairing the light touch with the tail shock. And the result is that the light touch comes to produce a strong gill withdrawal. Now, it's important to note that this is not the same as sensitization because it's very specific to that CS. And how does this happen? This depends on cooperation between CS and US pathways. Just like in the cerebellum, information from the CS pathway has to converge in the neural circuitry with information from the US pathway so as to increase an association. So to summarize, there's this activity-dependent enhancement during aplesia classical conditioning that builds on the sensitization story that you heard Kendall talk about. The CS is a weak sensory activation that primes a sensory neuron but causes no further change. The US is serotonin release, but too weak to cause sensitization. And the CS in the US is a primed sensory neuron response to an even weak level of serotonin. Its synapses become facilitated or stronger, and the combination of this activity-based priming and the serotonin modulation strengthens a specific CS pathway so that future touches cause more robust withdrawals. As with the cerebellum and eye blink conditioning, timing matters. Activity causes priming by modifying sensory neuron proteins. These changes only last about half a second. If the US is too late, no cooperation occurs and the animal fails to learn. So a small amount of training, as with classical conditioning, as with sensitization, leads to a short-term memory that will disappear soon. Repeated CS-US pairings involve long-term memory lasting weeks or days. With repeated training, proteins are activated in the nucleus of the cell, and which alter genes. And Kendall described the CREB genes, one which is activated, which promotes the growth of new synapses. There's another CREB2, which he didn't mention in the previous talk, which is deactivated as it inhibits the growth of new synapses. So long-term learning depends on activation of genes that promote both the growth of new synapses and the inhibition of other genes which are inhibiting growth of new synapses. Artificial deactivation of this CREB pathway enabled long-term memory with only a single trial. So the idea is that by turning off the inhibitory genetic pathway, the CREB2, you can actually facilitate learning, and Kendall and others began to look into the possibility that deactivating CREB2 might be a way to develop drugs that could accelerate learning. So let's review here at the end of the brain substrate section, have an interim summary. Classical conditioning seems to depend primarily on the cerebellum in the mammalian motor reflex, but with contributions from the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe for CS processing, such as in latent inhibition. Cerebellar circuitry seems suited for detecting CS-US associations, so CS and US pathways converge on inhibitory Purkinje neurons that initiate the CR pathway. Training enables the CS pathway to decrease the spontaneous activity of the Purkinje neurons, disinhibiting output of the interpositus nucleus to produce CRs. Learning seems to be driven by an error signal, as suggested by the Rescorla-Wagner model, which is generated in the inferior olive and which receives excitatory input from the US minus inhibitory feedback from the CR pathway, and this is the difference calculation which is essential to the Rescorla-Wagner theory. Discrete activation of the direct activation of the CS pathway alone can fully mimic behavioral classical conditioning. Damage to the cerebellum disrupts classical conditioning. In the medial temporal lobe, especially the hippocampus, seems responsible for CS processing, for encoding the cues. This is most readily apparent in latent inhibition, which is dependent on the hippocampus, but not in basic acquisition and extinction classical conditioning paradigms, which don't depend so much on the hippocampus. The rate of classical conditioning can be increased by synchronizing CS presentation to the occurrence of brain theta rhythms, which are distinctive bursts of activity that occur during exploration. Turning now to the invertebrate studies, which we just reviewed. In the aplysia, classical conditioning occurs when the CS pathway, a light touch, primes synapses for facilitation of serotonin released by the US pathway, which is a noxious shock. With repeated classical conditioning trials, long-term memory of the association is formed. This depends on the activation of proteins that return to the nucleus to direct activation of genes needed to grow additional synapses. If you'd like to know a bit more about the work of Kandel, there's a fabulous documentary called In Search of Memory, and I'm going to play for you now the trailer. I'd encourage you to find this and watch it. It describes not only his career, his life, beginning in Nazi-controlled Austria and fleeing, but also the development of his psychiatric interests as a doctor to the very molecular work that he did for which he won the Nobel Prize.
If the people go and see this movie and they remember it the next day, that is because there will be an alteration in gene expression in their brain. So every single person in the audience watching this film has a slightly different brain because they have learned somewhat different things. We are who we are because of what we learn and what we remember. Memory is the glue that binds our mental life together. I mean, it makes it possible for me to remember what I did this morning, what I did last week, what I did 6 years ago. It is what allows us to get continuity in our lives.
You look good for yourself too, man. What are you, about 82?
I'm 40.
Are you funny?
82. My father thought that I would go to Hollywood. And here I am.
We'll turn now in the last section of this lecture to talk about some clinical applications of the work on the behavioral and neural substrates of classical conditioning. Our objective here is to explain how conditioning applies to drug tolerance and overdose. Recall I described earlier the conditioned compensatory response. I'll review that again here now before we talk about the drug tolerance. Remember, a conditioned compensatory response is a CR that is the opposite of the UR. It helps to balance or correct for the US-UR reflex. For example, we described earlier, if you inject adrenaline, you get a heart rate increase, repeated procedure in the same testing chamber. The testing chamber is the Q, the CS. Eventually, this CS comes to produce a decrease in heart rate that helps maintain homeostasis or balance against the expected adrenaline injection. We observe this as tolerance as the testing chamber evokes a CR that weakens the overall effect of the drug, in this case adrenaline. So the idea here is that a particular context in which you are getting a drug essentially reduces the efficacy of that drug because the body is decreasing, in this case, the heart rate in anticipation of the drug's effect. But we can also see that in other types of drugs which have different effects on the brain. Drug tolerance increases with use in the same drug-taking context. Even subtle changes, for example, the drug taste, can overrun tolerance and increase the drug effects. And this is one of the reasons why we sometimes see overdose. We'll see, for example, you'll hear about someone who overdosed when they were taking drug in a hotel as opposed to overdosing at home. And one of the reasons may be that when you take a drug in an unfamiliar setting, you're not having that same contextual conditioned responding which allows you to take that large level of dose. So you're more likely to have an overdose in an unfamiliar context. We see this in a rat study as to follow. In first-time dose to rats, a large heroin dose led to 96% overdose the first time. In rats who were first given a small heroin dose before the larger dose, but in a different location, there was a 64% overdose. But in rats that were given a small dose before the larger dose, but in the same location, there was only a 32% overdose. So the idea is that being essentially primed with a small dose of heroin in the same location reduces the likelihood of overdose and makes the rats more tolerant to the heroin. Environmental cues, including the appearance and the smell of drug-taking location, produce a CR of drug craving in anticipation of the US. And the drug craving that addicts will feel is, in fact, that anticipatory lowering of dopamine and other physiological factors, which are essentially the anticipation. So the craving that an addict feels is really the body's homeostatic anticipation and preparation for the drug. So relapse can occur from exposure to such powerful CSs, which is one of the reasons why Alcoholics Anonymous and drug addiction programs instruct people to avoid as many cues as possible, and why they need help from non-drug using friends and family to avoid the powerful cues. So as an interim summary, conditioning explains the development of drug tolerance, which can lead to unexpected and sometimes fatal overdoses when drugs are taken in unusual places or unusual ways. So let's turn now to go back to the beginning of the lecture and review what is it that I hope you've learned. From behavioral processes, I hope you learned to identify and define the basic terminology of classical conditioning, to describe how Pavlov demonstrated classical conditioning in dogs, to distinguish between appetitive and aversive conditioning, to describe the processes of acquisition and extinction, describe the blocking effect and its theoretical significance, identify the key components of the Rescorla-Wagner model, and apply this model to classical conditioning phenomena, describe the role of timing in conditioning, and explain how some associations are more readily learned, that is, we're biased, and how ecological constraints can affect conditioning. For brain substrates, I'd like you to be able to describe the role of the cerebellum in conditioned responding, describe the role of inhibitory feedback in conditioning, and explain how the hippocampus can contribute to conditioning in mammalian reflexes, and at the invertebrate level, describe the cellular level influences on conditioning in aplesia. And at the clinical level, understand how classical conditioning explains drug tolerance and overdose. If you can do all of that, you're ready for the exam. But why don't we just check first to see how well you've comprehended it? We're going to have a little mini exam now. Here are 3 questions, and I'd like you to see how well you know each of them. The first is, lightning is usually followed by thunder. Eventually, we can be startled just by lightning alone. In this case, what is the unconditioned response? Is it being startled by thunder? Is it being startled by lightning? Is it the thunder or the lightning? Do you know the right answer? It's A. It's being startled by thunder. So that's the unconditioned response, okay? Because we naturally, in an unconditional fashion, are startled by the sound of the thunder, okay? Second question. In the Rescorla-Wagner model, if a novel CS, one you've never seen before, is followed by an unexpected US, the prediction error is positive, negative, 0, or it could be either. If you understand the Rescorla-Wagner model, you'll know that this is a situation that describes a positive error, because it's the difference between what actually occurred, which is the unexpected US, and the expectation, in which case there's no expectation. So the error is positive, which is what drives learning in a positive fashion. The next question, in mammals, the 2 sites where information about CS-US association can be stored in the cerebellum are the blank and the blank. If you remember the anatomy quiz from earlier, you would know that the answer is D, Purkinje cell in the cerebellar cortex and the interpositus nucleus. If you were able to answer all 3 of these questions correctly, you're probably in a good situation to do well on the exam. In any case, you can always go back and review the lecture and the slides. Thank you.